Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of the 2019 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. Doug Gooker here, your friendly moderator and local food systems and small farm educator in Decatur, Illinois. We appreciate you joining us once again for these webinars, and we'll do our very best to begin and end within the space of the lunch hour. This is a tight delivery period for educators to deliver their programs, so please understand why we are limiting our questions to the text box at the left during the presentation. I will do my best to make sure our presenters answer them as time allows or provide you with links if necessary. I have posted call-in information in the chat box if you continue to have audio or video issues. Additionally, you should have received the slide set for today's webinar in an email last night or early this morning. This presentation will be recorded and an email link to the archive presentation sent as soon as possible after it concludes. So if we run a little overtime or you need to leave early, you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar. There will also be a link for a very short online evaluation of this presentation, and we would. Now, today's presentation is from Bill Davison, my fellow local food system small farms educator, Livingston, McLean, and Woodford unit. Bill has had an exciting and diverse career path leading him to extension. He received his BS degree in wildlife biology and an MS in zoology. He has worked as a restoration ecologist for both the Nature Conservancy and the state of Illinois. And for 7 years, Bill also ran an organic fruit and vegetable farm in Congerville, Illinois. His work since starting with Extension back in 2013 has primarily focused on helping farmers adapt conventional farming practices to a sustainable model that meets both growing consumer demand for more healthful food and generates more on-farm income. His most extensive program in the area has been the Grand Prairie Grain Guild, and he has also been working with farmers, bakers, consumers, and creating and expanding the organic grains. Bill has also been extensively involved with perennial cropping systems, and that's what he's going to talk to us about today. So take it away, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Doug, and thanks everyone for joining. So what I'm going to do is talk about the work that I've done and our partners have done over the past 5 years or so to develop agroforestry systems for farms and to generally try to promote crop diversity. So the image you see here are some faculty and student researchers from University of Illinois that are doing research under a project called Agroforestry for Food. So this is an active area of research and publication and plant breeding work. So there's for this project. So I like to tell everyone about the Regenerative Agriculture podcast run by John Kemp with Advancing Eco-Agriculture, because this is one of the best sources of information for cutting edge issues around agriculture. It's very wide ranging, but tends to focus on soil health and plant health and some really innovative research that's being done. And John is very good at interviewing scientists and farmers and drawing information out of them. So this is a really good way to develop foundational knowledge around managing complex systems for soil health and plant health. The farmer on the right there is Klaus Martens. He was one of the guests on this podcast. And as an example of the kind of things you learn there, so Klaus was growing dry beans in New York State, and he really liked them as a crop and was making good money on them. But then after a number of years, he started to build up disease pressure and he had to stop growing them. So he then went to Cornell to researchers there and said, look, I have a really diverse crop rotation, 20 some crops that I work with, but I have this problem. Can you help me out? So they started doing research, and the plant you see in the foreground there with the yellow flowers is a type of mustard. So they figured out that if you grow a mustard in the rotation, it suppresses the pathogens in the soil that affect the bean roots. So they learned that. Klaus added mustard to his rotation, and that allowed him to grow dry beans again. So it's just an example of the kind of knowledge you can get from a podcast like this, and the kind of knowledge that you need to manage complex rotations, which is really what we're working towards with agroforestry, and our other work is to try to find ways for farmers to be able to grow more crops profitably. So this is a recent paper that also highlights what we call regenerative agriculture, which is this idea that you can improve the health of the soil, water quality, and the ecosystem based on the way you farm. This paper documents research in Iowa, and it focuses on corn, but the core principle is the same regardless of the crop, and that is if you increase your management skill, you can minimize your inputs and maximize your profits. And that's what this paper documents. So for corn, if you take this approach to where basically you manage the soil and the organic matter in your soil to be the primary source of fertility for the crop, you reduce your inputs, and it's 78% more profitable to farm in this way compared to the conventional model. And your profitability in this system is correlated with the percent organic matter in the soil, which I think is a key insight and shows that that is really what drives soil health and productivity. This image shows Kernza roots and annual wheat. So the dashed line across the top approximates the soil line, and the plant on the left with the deep roots is Kernza, which is intermediate wheatgrass. It's a perennial grain crop that's being developed by the Land Institute out in Salina, Kansas. And then the smaller plant to the right is annual wheat. So this just shows you why you want to try to get to the point where you can incorporate perennials into your crop rotations and on your farm, because those root systems are what are stabilizing the soil, improving the health of the soil, and building organic matter. There's a lot of research being done on Kernza. It is a potential component of an agroforestry system. The Forever Green Initiative is based out of the University of Minnesota. And this diagram just shows that they are doing complex genetic analyses on Kernza, and they're figuring out which genes control certain properties within the plant, and this will enable them to accelerate their progress in their breeding work. And so this is encouraging. Kernza is potentially already a viable crop depending on your farm and circumstances, but this type of work will improve yield, shatter loss rates, those type of things that will make it viable for more people, hopefully in the near term. And then my personal experience with agroforestry is in managing this project called the Refuge Food Forest. So this is an 1.5 acre planting in a city park in Normal, Illinois. It's open to the public. So what you're looking at here is an aerial photo showing the layout where you can see we have Chinese chestnut trees, hazelnut shrubs, different fruit trees, cane fruit like blackberries, raspberries, lots of currants, prairies, willows, that type of thing. So this is meant to be a demonstration site for agroforestry. If anyone visits Bloomington Normal or drives through, you're welcome to visit. It's about a mile northeast of Uptown Normal. It shows up on Google Maps. That's what you see here is a screen capture of Google Maps. So the Refuge Food Forest in the top right is where it's located. And you can visit. If you visit between late June and September, there'll be berries and fruit to pick, and you're welcome to pick whatever you want. So one of the key practices for agroforestry that we're promoting and researching is, again, soil health. And part of soil health is the fungi in the soil, especially the mycorrhizal fungi, which connect to plant roots. So this image shows the picture on the left is layers of wood chip mulch that we get from the town. This is how we manage the food forest. We use a lot of wood chips. You can see that the whitish fungi is colonizing the wood from the soil up, and there are layers based on the years that we have applied the mulch. The image on the right shows the root system of the fungi, and this gives you a sense of how extensive and dense it is. And the reason this is important is because if you're growing perennial crops like trees, shrubs, Kernza, most plants really, they form a relationship with the fungi. They physically connect to each other. The fungi can secrete acids and dissolve nutrients out of the soil, like phosphorus and other nutrients. The plants and the fungi communicate with each other. The plants can signal to the fungi that they need a specific nutrient, and the fungi can deliver that nutrient. And plants can communicate with each other through this sort of an internet in the soil for plants where, say, you have trees planted together, they're connected by the fungus. If insects attack a tree, neighboring trees will begin to secrete defensive compounds to ward off insect attack. So these are things we don't fully understand. We know that this happens. We really only know about 1% or less of what goes on in the soil. We know enough to know that it's important, and that if you pay attention to these details, it can improve the healthier soil, the healthier plants, and enable you to use fewer inputs. The other approach we take is really trying to maintain a lot of plant diversity on site. So for a farm, this could mean borders, fence rows, along waterways, any area where you could get in like a pollinator planting, native prairie strips, that type of thing. You will host these type of insects, which again, we don't understand all the relationships, but we know if you have plant diversity, you'll have insect diversity, and insect diversity confers real benefits to managing perennial plantings in terms of pollination, predator control, those types of things. So this is just a closer up view of the Refuge food forest. So looking at those circular beds, this is year one, showing you how we manage it. So we did put landscape fabric down and cover that with wood chips and then plant into it. So it's relatively weed free. We do have bindweed, which is our biggest challenge, but almost no annual weeds at this point, given the amount of wood chips we put down. So here we're looking at a couple peach trees at the end, and then blackberries on the left and black raspberries in the middle. And then this is what it looked like last year in year 4. So you can see the rate of growth we get out of peach trees, which are fast growers, but also the cane fruit is super vigorous. In terms of resources, the Savannah Institute is one of the best places to get information on this. So they produce what they call the Nutshell series, which is a podcast. So they interview farmers that have been doing different versions of agroforestry for, anywhere from 1 year to 20 some years. So it's a way for you to learn from people that are actively engaged in some form of agroforestry. And they also have a YouTube channel where they have started posting interviews between farmers. So the most recent one I saw is Gary Zimmer with Midwestern Bioag and a young farmer. And Gary's been doing silvopasture and innovative farming for 30 some years. And he basically talks to a young farmer about what he's learned, what he's currently doing. And so I think that this is some of the best information you can get. And this is the way that farmers can figure out what makes the most sense for them and how to begin to do this themselves. So if you listen to enough of these, for any given one, you'll pick up a few key insights in terms of, what crops have worked, what hasn't worked, how people manage the system. So if you listen to them, maybe you take some notes, and then you begin to piece together your version of a plan. And this book, Planting Tree Crops, is a really good resource to get you started. They sort of go through each crop, tell you the pros and cons, advice on how to begin, and then if you couple this book with other sources, you can begin to get a sense of how to get started. And so these systems can be managed at a large scale, and they can be mechanized. And so that's what this shows here. Fruit trees with a side discharge wagon filled with wood chips. So you can set up systems in this way where you spread mulch with the tractor and a spreader like this. There's lots of different ways to do that. Sometimes wood chips are free for the asking from landscape companies, utility companies. If you're in town or near a town, the Parks Department often generates large quantities of wood chips, and it's basically a free source of carbon and nutrients that you can use for your system. Okay, so we have reached the point where people like Kevin Walls, who recently got his PhD from U of I, are starting to publish about their research on agroforestry. So this is a recent paper from Kevin. So if you are inclined to reading the primary literature, I would recommend reading everything you can find from Kevin and others. So he basically goes in and documents, in this case, the profitability of black walnut alley cropping in the Midwest. So looking at different regions of the Midwest and comparing alley cropping with annual cropping and sort of charting out where it's more profitable. He's got other papers on silvopasture and different parts of the system that document profitability and management scenarios. So this is an example of silvopasture. This is a diagram from the Savannah Institute book, and it just shows you that. So one way to navigate agroforestry to deal with the early years is through alley cropping, which is what you see here. So the top shows small trees and corn plants in the middle. So on a farm, you basically can continue, if you have a corn soybean rotation, you can continue that rotation for a number of years, maybe 4 to 6, I don't know, something like that, depending on your farm and the trees you're growing and how you manage it. There will be a period of time where you can, plant grains in between. But then it'll reach a point where the trees are casting enough shade that they become competitive with corn. But then you can switch to a small grain like wheat or oats or rye, something like that. And because they do a lot of their growth in the spring, it's not as competitive, and you can get reasonable yields from a small grain. So you can extend your alley cropping a few more years in that scenario. And then ultimately, if the trees get big and have a large canopy, you get to the point where some form of maybe hay or livestock on pasture would be the final phase of alley cropping. But at that point, you are now generating income from the trees. So here's a visual of what this looks like. This is research out of France where they are growing a timber crop, and they continue to harvest small grains throughout the life of the planting. And this system is 40% more productive than growing either crop in isolation. So it can be highly productive. And if you prune the trees up like this for timber, they're not as competitive with the crop in the alleys. And Kevin has published a paper on this as well. So other things for farmers to think about are ways to do this that minimize risk and cost. So there are programs in the Farm Bill that you can use. This shows a creek and a riparian buffer program. So that's one thing to look into, would be riparian buffer. Others would be things like windbreaks, shelter belts. There's cost share for that. Some of the contracts are 10 years. So it would be possible to get cost share, establish a planting. You can't harvest crops during the contract period, but if you're growing something like Chinese chestnuts, they don't hit peak productivity for something like 10 years. So it potentially could match up to where when it comes out of the contract, you've hit your a good level of productivity, and then you can switch to harvesting the crop. In terms of resources to help you think through the economics of this, there are quite a few. So the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri is a really good resource for a wide variety of topics around agroforestry. They've done a lot of work with Chinese chestnuts and elderberries. So they have an Elderberry financial decision support tool, which is basically a spreadsheet where you can go in and look at the data, and then you can manipulate the data and see how it affects the profitability of the system. So this is a way for you to sort of model out different scenarios, see what you might be able to do on your farm. And then another company that's a resource is Propogate Ventures. They're out of the Northeast, but they have some pretty innovative programs around agroforestry. They'll work with farms, help them think through what makes sense, how to set it up, who the buyers are, how to finance it, that type of thing. There are Midwestern versions of this. Midwest Agroforestry Solutions is another company that operates in the Midwest that will work with farmers and guide you through the whole process. In terms of other resources like farms that you can visit or just learn from their experience, one of the best is Red Fern Farm in Iowa. So they are just across the border near Davenport, I believe. But they've been growing Chinese chestnuts for over 20 years. They have a U-pick operation for Chinese chestnuts and pawpaws and other things. But they've given podcasts, talks, they've published papers, that's all documented on their website. They also are part of a buying cooperative in Iowa, so there is unmet demand for chestnuts. There's a commercial market for them, and there are buyers in Iowa that will buy wholesale quantities of chestnuts. So Tom Wall is the farmer there. He's an amazing resource. He knows a whole lot about Chinese chestnuts and managing the system. And he's produced some good guides, some 2 to 3 page guides on sort of here's what you need to know if you're going to try to grow trees, how to plant them and manage them, keep the deer from eating them, that type of thing. And then in Illinois, we have Chestnut Ridge down in Pike County. They've been growing a different type of chestnut for 20 some years. But they have mechanized their operation and they've made some of their own equipment. So it's an example of a farm where I believe most of the operations are mechanical. They're harvested by a machine, sorted by a machine. And so it's an example of a successful chestnut orchard. They market mostly online. So they have online sales in the fall. And I think they move most of their chestnuts through that system. Okay, as far as other resources that you can use. So if you want to model out Chinese chestnuts. Michigan State has a calculator where you can go in. Again, it's a spreadsheet, and you can look at the numbers, change the numbers. They have a baseline data for cherry trees, I believe, and then you can go in and model out Chinese chestnuts. As far as a resource, another good resource, the Savannah Institute has produced a guide for long-term leases, which if you're a landowner or a farmer and you're looking to do this, this is good guidance on how to have a conversation with the landowner about a long-term lease. Because if you're going to grow an agroforestry system, you need to negotiate a long-term lease. And so this is a resource to take you through that. The Midwest Elderberry Cooperative is based out of Missouri. Terry Durham was at the Moses Conference in La Crosse this year, and he gave a really good talk on elderberries. He's been growing them for 30 some years down in Missouri. They work with native elderberries, and again, they have cooperative market and buyers. They'll buy wholesale quantities of elderberries. There is unmet demand for them, and we think elderberries have a lot of potential. You can manage them on almost like on an annual basis. So you mow them down every year, and then they regrow 5 to 6 feet, and you get uniform cropping. And it seems like one of the best ways to begin if you have an interest in exploring agroforestry. This crop is relatively easy to manage, has commercial markets, has a lot going for it in terms of the nutritional properties of the berry, the fact that you can also harvest and sell the flowers. You can harvest up to 20% of the flowers without lowering the yield for berries. There is a lot of research around the health benefits of eating them, so there are real opportunities with elderberries. And then this publication on mulberries, it's just an example of a crop that is easy to grow. One of the challenges with them is that the berry is highly perishable. So it would be hard to have large-scale national markets for elderberries because they are fragile and they don't ship well. However, that is also a niche in the marketplace. So because they are perishable, there's an opportunity for people to think through how to grow them, handle them, and market them locally. So the other advantage to mulberries is you probably know they are easy to grow, have few pests, crop annually, are really nutritious, taste good. So they have a lot going for them. You can grow them as part of a silvopasture system, and if you're raising pigs on pasture, they can be a source of food for your pigs. There's a history of that in Illinois, and varieties specifically developed to produce over a long season. So it feeds your pigs. Something else I'm doing is teaching propagation workshops. So we're trying to help more people learn how to grow their own plants. So this is a way that you can lower your input costs. So we have workshops coming up April 5th and 6th. They're full for this year. But basically we teach people how to graft fruit trees, how to care for Chinese chestnuts, so how to plant the seeds, and how to propagate currants and elderberries from cuttings, which is quite easy to do. So if you want to begin this, you can begin at a very low cost by getting started with some plants and propagating them on your own. So you can start this in your yard or in a small corner of your farm. Just get some plants started, get experience growing them, handling them, see how they do on your soil, see what type of challenges you face from deer, insects, disease, that sort of thing. I mean, this can all be done for almost no upfront cost if you learn how to propagate, and it's pretty easy to do. So the Artisan Grain Collaborative is a group that I work with that is working really hard to try to support crop diversification in general. We're focused on grains with this group, but the end goal is to help farmers get to the point where they can move from grains into agroforestry type systems. And this diagram, this just shows some of the organizations that are members and are working towards this system. So we are expanding into Minnesota, Michigan, down into the St. Louis area with programming and support for farmers, so connecting them to local markets and helping them develop the skills to direct market staple crops. Another organization that we started is called Regenerative Illinois, and this one is more focused on agroforestry and the idea that you can produce food and improve the health of the soil, the farm, your community, and the ecosystem that it's part of. And this is a group of us that met to hash out the organizational structure, funding sources, and to develop the organization. And we have been successful in getting grants. So we have staff, have been conducting workshops, and have really made a lot of progress. One of the projects that we're working on is in the Mackinac River watershed in partnership with the Parklands Foundation, which is a land trust in Bloomington Normal. So what you're looking at here is the Mackinac River north of Bloomington Normal. So you can kind of see the northern edge of Normal in the bottom of this image, and then the two drinking water lakes north of town, Lake Evergreen and Lake Bloomington. The green is woodland cover along the Mackinac River, and it signifies rolling terrain. So this is where we are trying to bring to bear enough resources to overcome the barriers to agroforestry, to develop pilot projects and to make progress with crop diversity in this watershed. So we are recruiting partners, writing grants, hosting workshops, and trying to get agroforestry plantings going. And the idea here is that Parklands owns 4,000 acres of nature preserves along the river. We're targeting land acquisition near or adjacent to those preserves so that an agroforestry farm would be buffered by natural habitat, and then the farm itself would buffer the habitat. So it's a win-win scenario where we can show that food production and conservation are mutually beneficial to each other. That's one of the main goals of this work, is to demonstrate the viability of that concept and to create farms that sort of blur the lines between natural habitat and agriculture. And that's what you can do through a regenerative version of agroforestry. So if you could imagine chestnut orchards with perennial grass under them, from the standpoint of certain types of wildlife, birds, deer, that type of thing, that kind of a farm would function as habitat for them. And it would connect preserves together. So it would increase the connectivity of the habitat and have a wide host of benefits for soil health, water quality, and those types of things. So this is an example of what it can look like. And this is what we're working towards, is demonstrating that you can manage natural areas with livestock in a way that generates income for farmers and improves the quality of the habitat. So if you see in the foreground of this photo, you can see some shrubs, which for most woodland areas in the Midwest consist of bush honeysuckle and autumn olive, which are exotic species that form a solid canopy, shade the soil, kill the ground cover, and lead to soil erosion and a general lack of diversity. But if you notice where the sheep are, there's more grass and fewer shrubs. So that's one of the management scenarios we're working to develop, would be to have an agroforestry farm adjacent to a preserve to intensively manage livestock, rotate them through the preserve to browse back the shrubs and ultimately kill the shrubs. And so this benefits the natural area and the people that manage it, because otherwise you have to go in there with chainsaws and herbicide to kill the shrubs, which is really labor intensive and expensive to do. So if we can do it with livestock, that's a win-win scenario. And so this is the type of thing we're pursuing along the Mackinac, and the kind of thing that farmers could think through. So any people that have a farm with woodland that probably is full of exotic shrubs, you don't necessarily have to raise the livestock, but maybe you have a neighbor or the neighbor's kids have an interest. You could approach them, bring up the subject, and see what kind of conversations you can have around managing the land in this way. So those are the areas we're working on. This is a picture of Chinese chestnut. One thing I could mention about them is you see the spiny burr there. Part of the reason that they're a viable crop is that those nuts are protected by that burr until the burr splits and they drop. So it's harder for squirrels to eat your harvest. And they tend to crop annually. They're sweet, taste really good, have a wide variety of uses. They could replace corn as an industrial commodity, and they could be food for people. So I hope I've stimulated a few questions from anyone. We have time to go through what, if any have been typed out or any that you have, feel free to ask questions.
Well, there's a couple over in the chat box, Bill. First one is, do you have suggested cultivars of, I believe that was mulberries, for people to eat or to sell?
Yeah, if you look up that SARE guide, if you just type in SARE, mulberry, agroforestry, it'll take you to that guide. And that's a good resource that'll describe the different varieties, the nurseries that sell them. And I think a good way to begin with that would be if you could get a sampling of those, plant them out on your farm, see how they grow and how they taste, because these are not refined crops that have had a lot of breeding work done on them. So ultimately the taste is a matter of personal preference. So it would be really hard to say this one tastes good and this one doesn't. It's more how you grow them, handle them, and market them. I think my experience has been that in general, mulberries taste good. I haven't tried a lot of different varieties, but they seem to have potential, and that guide would be the place to begin.
Okay. A follow-up question on the mulberries was, Bill, are you working with any of these in any of your work in the Mackinac or around Normal with your agroforestry projects?
We have mulberries at the food forest, and we are promoting them in the Mackinac River Watershed Project. There's a lot of mulberries growing on the landscape, but there aren't a lot of them that are intentionally planted and managed. I am growing and pruning mulberries at the food forest, treating them like a fruit tree to see how they respond and how they produce. But they're really vigorous plants. They're easy to manage, and they have relatively few problems from pests and disease.
Okay. Another question, different, is are the U.S. Forestry or State Forest Service supportive of agroforestry? And do they help fund people looking to move into this?
They are supportive. There are USDA programs around agroforestry. There are grants that could potentially support agroforestry. There's something called the Community Forest Program that the USDA and the National Forest Service administer. and they give grants out to people or communities that want to protect forest resources. And there is the possibility for using that grant to manage woodlands, forests as a form of agroforestry.
Okay. Good. Another question is, would you mind talking a little more about Kevin Walt's work with the Midwest Agroforestry Solutions and how they're trying to make all this work profitably for individuals?
Yeah, so Kevin is an ambitious guy. He's got big plans. So he has a company where he will work with farmers and install plantings on their farm, and he'll help you think through the whole process. He also has plans to establish a 50-acre demonstration site at Allerton Park. And he's currently in the process of writing grants to support the development of 3 research farms in Illinois so that farmers will be able to go look at commercial scale agroforestry production on a farm, hopefully relatively close to them. So there's a lot going on. You can follow Kevin's work through the Savannah Institute and his other, the Midwest Agroforestry website, but that organization is one of the best sources of information for us. And there's a lot being done in Wisconsin. So if you're in Northern Illinois or you want to see more developed systems and can go to Wisconsin, you can participate in field days or set up visits to farms that have established plantings, and you can, learn from them and their experience.
There's a comment from one of today's listeners in McHenry County that squirrels like chestnuts there, and that the husks do not bother them at all. So I guess they've adapted in McHenry County.
Wow, they must have some tough squirrels. Those are some serious spines, and the trees that I'm growing, I haven't noticed the squirrels getting into them, but squirrel density varies a lot. So I'm in a town. For anyone that's in an urban area, you probably have a higher density of squirrels because of all the bird feeders. In rural areas, especially if you're in open fields, I don't think there'll be a big problem. I mean, if you're near the edge of a woodlot, they might eat some, but my experience has been that those birds are a real deterrent. But you do have to pick up the nuts as they drop. So they drop day to day over a period of time, and once they hit the ground, then they're fair game for all the deer and squirrels and other things that want to eat them. But that's a pretty standard practice for managing the system, and there are mechanical harvesters and ways to do it where you just mow the grass and then drive over it and pick them up.
The listener had a follow-up, and it was that these weren't Chinese chestnuts, but they were an American chestnut.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if maybe the American chestnut has different burrs. I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. Here's another question. What are some of the known difficulties with utilizing grazing animals in native preserves? Do they eat native spring ephemeral plants?
Yeah, so that's a complex setup. So it requires intensive management and rotational grazing, and it'll depend on the quality of the habitat. So if you have a woodland area that has nice spring ephemerals, then you probably aren't going to want to put livestock in that period of time. But typically what happens is you get a flush of flowers in the spring, and then they fade, the shrubs leaf out, and you have very little to almost no summer growth because no sunlight or very little sunlight gets to the soil. So that is the time where if you can get animals in there to eat the shrubs, you're actually benefiting the system, because at that point, the spring ephemerals are largely dormant. So yeah, you have to think that through. You can't just put them in there and leave them. You got to set up temporary electric netting type fencing probably, and then you got to watch them, and you got to make sure that they're eating the shrubs and not like eating the bark off the trees or eating things you don't want them to eat. And you have to move them when they start to do damage. But that's the basic scenario. We know it's doable. We know people are doing it and it works. We just have to put the pieces together, find the right landowners and farmers and people that want to cooperate and work together to figure that all out.
That's true. It is working. I know they're doing it up in Wisconsin with goats, and it works quite well. And Minnesota. Another question, and this is on your Artisan Grain Collaborative Guild, your Artisan Grain Guild. Could you talk more about the collective and how it is strengthening farmers' connections to markets? And then a follow-up was that also, where in Michigan is this collaborative working? They must have a connection.
So the collaborative, the Artisan Grain Collaborative, is an amazing group. We have received quite a few grants, large sums of money, have been very successful in that regard. We are trialing and testing rye, wheat, oats, a variety of crops, including corn, getting them tested through the Food Pilot Lab at University of Illinois, making that data available to farmers, bakers, distillers, brewers, as a way to begin to open up markets and to show people that you can source local grain. You can use them for a variety of different purposes, and we're getting to the point where we're providing information that would enable a farmer to say, grow a specific type of rye that is well suited to distilling or baking, and to be able to go to a business and give them a data sheet and say, I'm growing this rye. These are the specs. We know it makes good whiskey or bread or whatever. And you can begin to have a conversation with the buyer. And at that point, it comes down to the farmer's ability to tell their story and to pitch the crop. But that's where we're at. I mean, farmers are doing it and it's working. So there are choices within rye, within wheat and oats, where you can have those kind of conversations. We also, a lot of the people and groups are based out of Chicago, so there are connections to universities, to funders, to different nonprofits up there. We're working on institutional accounts. So we see tremendous potential for farm to school, farm to hospital, farm to prison, those type of accounts where farmers could sell staple crops like grains into those markets. And so we're working to make that happen. There are challenges to that, but we know it can work. And we just need more people to engage. We need farmers to just keep asking, go. And it's not about Chicago, wherever you're at in your town. It can be a small rural town. Go talk to your pizza. If you have a pizza restaurant in town, you can tell them, you can grow soft red winter wheat, the main commodity wheat in Illinois, and they can add 20% of that flour to their existing recipe, and it will have minimal impact. So they could choose to support a local farm, and it's a minor inconvenience to them, and you can begin to build a relationship there and build a market. And then, you can go to your school, hospital, any institutional account and just say, I'm a farmer, I'm growing this grain, I'd love to sell to you, let's talk about it. And then you got to work through the, issues around pricing. But if we get enough people doing that, someone will experience success, and then we'll have a model to talk about and promote, and then, it can move forward from there.
Interesting, Bill. I have a question. Are we beginning to build the infrastructure like millers, the people that can mill our grain so we can sell it?
There's an increasing number of mills. We have a commercial scale mill in Iroquois County with a very high capacity for milling. They do work with about 5 farms right now. The main challenge is we have tremendous productive capacity, so the markets are not there to support really large acreages at this point. That's what we're working on. But there are mills popping up, and then so for any farmer out there, you can get an 8-inch Meadows mill for somewhere around $2,000 new, a little less used. That would be a way for you to get experience milling. I mean, you can just mill livestock feed or mill for your personal use if you want to experience grain and how good your own grain can be for human consumption. You also can get small mills, home scale mills. So there's something called the mock mill. There are different companies that make tiny mills. They have like 3-inch stones in them. They are about the size of a coffee pot. They cost a couple $100s. You just set them on your countertop. You can mill your own crops, and there are things to do that are really simple. You can make pancakes, which is incredibly easy to do. You can make muffins and quick bread. You don't have to go right to sourdough bread, which is the harder thing to do. You can make cornbread, which can be remarkably good. But if you want to try to get into these markets, you've got to do that because you have to be able to talk about your crops, what they taste like, why someone should, buy from you. Basically, you have to be able to tell that story. So yeah, a $200 mill is a way to start.
Okay. And a very good point, Bill. You need to know your product so you can sell your product. Have another question, totally different. How does the spraying of corn and soybeans affect tree farming in this area, in the growing of these perennial trees and shrubs?
That's a common question, and that's a big concern. So the best answer that we have at this point is register your farm on Driftwatch and plant hybrid poplars as a windbreak around any. If you're going to devote a field to planting perennial plants, it makes sense to put that windbreak in. Those poplars can grow 10 feet in a season, so you basically have an instant windbreak. It's not foolproof given the nature of some of the modern formulations out there, but it is a best practice to minimize damage.
That's excellent advice, Bill. People need, if they have specialty crops or anything besides corn and soybeans, they need to get their fields registered on Driftwatch Field Watch. Have a comment from one of the listeners on your line about following your talk about milling your own products. They say they have made cornbread from their own Floriana red flint corn.
Yeah, that's a good variety. If you can grow open pollinated corn like that and many others, it is remarkably good. And cornbread is simple. I have a divided pan, which you can buy at Farm and Fleet, a cast iron pan that's divided into little triangles. You can mill your corn, mix up a simple recipe, pour the batter in there, and it bakes in about 8 minutes. So you can have it whenever you want it for dinner at very little time involved. And it is so good. I mean, I feel like if more farmers did that, made cornbread, share it with your friends and neighbors, take it to some social events, that's the kind of thing we need to do to expose people to the kind of quality that we could produce. And because I think people have no idea, almost no one has an idea of how good corn can be in cornbread. And it's not just cornbread. I mean, grits and polenta and hominy and tortillas. I mean, corn is incredibly flexible, and it's really fun. It makes your food a lot more interesting.
It sounds like it would be good. I would imagine anything freshly ground is better than something that's been sitting in a warehouse for a few years. Do we have any more questions for Bill? If not, Bill, I would like to ask you once again if you could mention some of those resources you talked about, like the Savannah Institute, the work that they're doing, as well as you mentioned over in Missouri and some other places that people could follow up with for more resources. If you'd just like to mention those one more time.
Yeah, so Red Fern Farm in Iowa is an amazing resource. The Midwest Agroforestry Center in Missouri. There are USDA agroforestry resources. There's Pike County Chestnut Orchard, which they have a website for their business. Then there's the Elderberry Cooperative out of Missouri, and Terry Durham is the leader of that project, and they have field days and a lot of resources around the elderberries. They produce guides to managing them, so they basically tell you all the lessons that they have learned. And one thing that Terry said at the Moses conference, and this kind of surprised me, is that they do trap Japanese beetles. What they do is they put large, like 55-gallon drum pheromone traps on the perimeter of the planting, and then they spray kaolin clay in the middle. So they push the beetles to the edges, and they go into these traps, and apparently that does lower pressure from Japanese beetles.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I'd like to, if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to thank our presenter, Bill Davison, our local food systems and small farms educator up in the Bloomington-Normal area, for this fabulous presentation in this very relative and timely area of agriculture. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar, and I hope you got some information that will help you in your small farm endeavors. Hopefully, even something you can put in place yet this winter or put in place in the coming year. Please look for an email from us with a link to the archived webinar on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel, as well as a very short evaluation of the webinar you have just watched. We do look for your feedback, and we use it to shape our future webinars. With that, I wish you a fabulous rest of the day and a productive start to your 2019 season. Thanks again.